Okay, good morning. Believe we're going. Gonna pull this thing up. Let's see. And so we're working our way back. Last time we made it to Civil War and the causes of the Civil War. Oh, what the heck are you doing? Come on, do a presentation. Don't do some crazy stuff. All right, and so now we're working our way back basically to the into the age of Jackson. So the first thing we're working back. You got the Mexican American War, Manifest Destiny. So kind of an 1840s kind of thing. And it's the belief that the U.S. was supposed to spread sea to shine and sea. Um, all the way to California, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This is kind of the picture that goes with Manifest Destiny. It's almost a religious belief that God wanted us to spread across the continent. And so, like, the angel is kind of going with the folks in the covered wagon there. And there's the Indians and the buffalo kind of running away, and they're not too happy about the angel. So people in the way, like Indians and Mexico, own the southwestern part of the United States, just kind of out of luck because they're in the way. All right, the politician, the American leader that's most associated with this is James Polk. He was a Democrat from Tennessee, like Andrew Jackson. He was a big admirer of Jackson. Jackson's nickname was Old Hickory. Polk's nickname was Young Hickory, and he ran for president in 1844. He had been governor of Tennessee, but he was an underdog. So the name for an underdog was Dark Horse, and so he promised to annex Texas and Oregon. That was his campaign slogan. So he was going to make Texas part of the United States. Texas was a country at the time, had gotten its independence from Mexico in the 1840s, I'm sorry, 1836. And one of the campaign slogans was a 54, 40, or 5. So he demanded Oregon all the way up to the southern border of Alaska, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north. All right, well, he ended up compromising. He could tell that he was going to end up getting in a war with Mexico over the Southwest. And so he didn't want to be fighting a two-front war. We remember from our studies of the world wars that was tough on Germany. Ultimately, it's probably the cause of Germany losing the world wars, that they had to fight a two-front war. So he didn't want to be fighting Britain and Mexico at the same time. So he compromised over Oregon at 49 degrees north. That's the reason we have the northern border at 49 degrees north. But he wanted California. California's got, great climate, good for farming, agricultural, citrus fruits. We remember from Grapes of Wrath. And also there on the Pacific Ocean, the West Coast, it'd be really good for open up trade with China. China, having more people than any other country in the world, has always been, a key market for trade, a key source of trade, and would be good for the economy. So he wants California. California, like Texas, was a Mexican state, and like Texas, not many Mexicans lived in California. So the question was not, would California forever be part of Mexico? The question was, who was going to get it? Was it going to be Britain, or was it going to be the United States? And so he wants to get California before Britain gets it. All right. So he picks a fight. Remember, Polk picks a fight with, when he becomes president, he picks a fight with Mexico over where the border with Mexico was. He claimed that the border was the Rio Grande. That's what the border is today. Mexico claimed that the border was the Nueces River, which would have made Texas about half as big as it is today, and would have made, that's more land for Mexico. And so he put a general named Old Rough and Ready in the disputed territory. Zachary Taylor was the general. And he kind of baited Mexico into attacking the United States. All right, and so they did, and at that point, Polk could say, well, hey, American blood's been shed on American soil, so I don't have a choice but to go to war. The two heroes of the war were Zachary Taylor. He went on to become the 12th president. Winfield Scott captured Mexico City. You may remember this famous battle at a place called Chapultepec. It's kind of like the Mexican version of the Alamo. A bunch of cadets were holding out against the American army, and the last cadet jumped from the top of the fort with a Mexican flag in his hand rather than giving up the flag. And so at that point, Mexico City had fallen. So that's pretty much the end of the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and gave the United States the entire Southwest, pretty much completing Manifest Destiny. Okay, we'll back it up to the age of Jackson. All right, so Jackson is the champion of the common man. He's our 7th president. He's our first Democrat president. He got elected in 1828 when all white males got the right to vote in most states. You know, you didn't have to, before 1828, you had to be a property owner. There were property qualifications for having the right to vote. But the common white man got to vote in most states, and they voted overwhelmingly for Jackson. All right, well, Jackson enacts something called the spoil system, where he gives government jobs to his political supporters, which kind of gives an incentive to to vote for common people to vote for Jackson. And his argument was that anybody could tell the difference between right and wrong and do a government job. Spoil system would be pretty controversial and would last till the late era 1800s. All right, Jackson probably best known for the Trail of Tears. One of the first laws Congress passed in 1830 when Jackson became president. He became president in 1829. Was the Indian Removal Act. There were 2 court cases concerning Indian removal. The Cherokees sued. Remember, they were one of the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, are those 5 civilized tribes. And they lost in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, but they won in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. All right, so that leads to the Trail of Tears. 18,000 Cherokee had to leave. 5,000 died along the way. The very old and the very young. And so, Trail of Tears always associated with, he's responsible for it. Andrew Jackson, responsible for it. All right. We know, hey, the Cherokee Nation, their capital was right up the interstate from us, New Echota. Okay. Other events of the Jackson presidency: the nullification crisis. John C. Calhoun in South Carolina hated the tariff. The high tariff. They felt like it was basically a tax on slavery, tax on slave coats, just raised their Southerners' prices and benefited Northern industry, and so said they weren't going to pay the tariff, nullify the tariff. And Jackson says they got to pay the tariff, and Civil War almost breaks out over Southern refusal to pay the tariff. And it goes so far as Jackson threatening to hang his former Vice President Calhoun. All right, but Henry Clay comes up with a compromise tariff, and so, the nullification crisis comes to an end. But it kind of foreshadows what happens in the Civil War because the South had threatened secession over the tariff. Okay, you also got the bank wars. Jackson sees the Bank of the U.S. as kind of a monopoly and a tool for the rich to dominate the common man. And he repeals the renewal of the bank, pulls the funds out of the Bank of the U.S., starts putting them into these pet banks that make unwise loans to common people, and that kind of results in the Panic of 1837. Jackson was already out of office by the time it happened, but his successor, Martin Van Buren, kind of paid the price for it. So you got that bad economy in the 1830s. All right, the Whig Party was the party that didn't like Jackson. They felt like he acted too much like a king. He had set a record for the number of vetoes during his administration. And so, the Jacksonian era had the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. Okay, the reform movements in the age of Jackson. You're going to have, they all kind of come out of the Second Great Awakening, which was a group of religious revivals in the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s. And believers in the Second Great Awakening believed that we needed to kind of perfect American society, bring heaven down to earth. And so probably the 2 leading reform movements coming out of this Second Great Awakening were abolitionism and the women's movement. All right, abolition. Our leading abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who led slaves to their freedom on the Underground Railroad. William Lloyd Garrison had an abolitionist paper called the Liberator. Frederick Douglass, former slave and speechmaker, influenced Abraham Lincoln a lot, and then John Brown tried to lead a slave rebellion by giving guns to all the slaves, and they were going to rise up against the masters. Of course, he got caught, but a violent abolitionist. Okay, the other big reform movements, the women's movement, they're rebelling against the cult of domesticity. They're also pushing temperance. They don't want men drinking too much because, that makes them bad husbands and violent to their families, and they don't show up for work. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention was our first ever women's rights convention. They write something called Seneca Falls, New York. Stanton and Mott were the leaders of it. They wrote something called the Declaration of Sentiments that said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." He has appears a lot in that declaration, referring to men generally. All right, the Transcendentalists were these folks that believed, kind of group of thinkers in Concord, Massachusetts, kind of centered there. Believe that you want to rise above kind of peer pressure and common people's beliefs, especially like the belief in slavery and Indian removal. You don't trust authority. We're all connected by this thing called the Oversoul, and the leaders of it are Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote Self-Reliance, and Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Civil Disobedience. Really influenced the Gandhi and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1900s. All right, so that's the Transcendentalists. All right, and then you have this new religion really coming out of the Second Great Awakening, the Mormon faith, came out of Western New York. The founder was Joseph Smith. He ended up getting killed in Illinois, and so Brigham Young led the Mormons to Utah, and BYU, Brigham Young University, in Utah is named after Brigham Young. And then finally you had these utopian societies of folks who felt like they couldn't really perfect America, couldn't really fix America, so they'll form these little communities where they'll get it right, these kind of perfectionist societies. Oneida was the most famous one of these, kind of a free love community, again in Western New York, like Seneca Falls, and eventually they started making silverware, and the Oneida Corporation comes out of that group. Okay, two more. You got slavery and then the market revolution. All right, so remember the social structure in the South in the age of Jackson was very hierarchical. Planters were kind of the 1% who owned a whole lot of slaves. About 24% of whites in the South maybe owned 10 or less slaves. 75% didn't own a lot of slaves or owned no slaves, but they wanted slaves. So, you really wasn't a lot of abolitionism among whites in the South. Most slaves lived on big plantations where there were 100 more slaves. On these plantations, better be a house slave than a field hand. The work of a field hand was awfully rough. Physically more difficult than being a house slave. There were, 4 slave rebellions. In what year was it? I'm going to put it at, I think it's 1831. The Nat Turner Rebellion, where in Virginia, Nat Turner and other slaves killed a lot of whites on plantations. He was executed for it, but the South really freaked out about it and started passing these slave codes, starting in Virginia, but spreading throughout the South, saying slaves couldn't learn to read, slaves couldn't have a gun, slaves couldn't be off the plantation without a pass. Abolitionists, we've mentioned abolitionists. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad are fighting against, helping slaves escape. If a slave tried to escape, and there's a picture of Harriet. Let's see. one of these pictures of Harriet Tubman and her family. But maybe, no, neither one of these are. These are just pictures of slave families. A slave who tried to run away was going to get whipped. So generally speaking, the more common resistance was to work slow, break tools, or to pretend to be sick. The worst parts of the slave system was the whippings and then the slave auctions where families would be separated. Okay, and then finally you got the market revolution kind of coming out of the War of 1812. It's going to involve kind of the expansion of slavery with the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's cotton gin makes slavery profitable. In the North, you've got the factory system. Samuel Slater brought the kind of blueprint for the factory system in his mind from Britain. The first factory workers in Massachusetts were the Lowell girls, as young ladies who would work, and then for a time as young ladies, then they would go home to raise families. The Lowell girls were replaced by immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, Irish and German immigrants. The Irish immigrants were coming to the United States as a result of the potato famine in Ireland. Germans were coming as a result of failed revolutions. Immigrants have always been willing to work long hours and dangerous jobs for lower wages. Party bosses welcomed the Irish immigrants because they could get them, in exchange for kind of setting them up with a decent life. They could get votes from them. The Know Nothing Party was kind of the anti-immigrant party of that time. Another part of the market revolution was transportation improvements such as the Erie Canal, the National Road, and the steamboat. Inventions of the market revolution. The steel plow helped farmers in the West, and the telegraph improved by Samuel Morse improved communication. Politically, Henry Clay's American system was the tariff to help northern industry, the transportation improvements such as the National Road, and the Second Bank of the U.S., all right, to improve the economy. All right, and that's it. Okay, I'll be sending it to you.